Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a seriously fascinating journey through time. We're going to uncover the true origins of hacking, and I promise you it looks absolutely nothing like those dark, hoodie-wearing cybercriminals we all picture today. No, this is actually a coming-of-age story. It's a tale about a loss of innocence, incredibly clever students, and the profound evolution of technology. So get ready, because we are heading all the way back to the 1950s to see exactly how a culture of lighthearted college pranks eventually escalated into modern cyber paranoia.
Okay, let's dive into this. Picture this visual for a second. You wake up, look up at the central building on a prestigious university campus, and perched perfectly on top of this massive rounded dome is a completely realistic replica of a campus police car. But oh, it doesn't stop there. Inside this replica car is a fake police officer, and sitting right next to him is a box of donuts, right? It's absurd, it's hilarious, and it took a monumental amount of engineering brilliance to pull off without getting caught. This was an entirely innocent physical prank, and believe it or not, this is exactly where the concept of hacking was actually born.
Chapter 1. The MIT Origins of Hacking.
You know, in this early era, the definitions of right and wrong were entirely different. In a lot of ways, what's considered a harmless joke versus, say, a serious crime, well, that often depends entirely on who happens to hold the power at the time. Look right here at this definition. The term hacker originally popped up around 1955 at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Back then, a hacker wasn't some cybercriminal writing malicious code in a basement. No way. A hacker was simply a student who pulled elaborate practical jokes. The whole point of these hacks was to publicly demonstrate your cleverness, your engineering prowess, and your ability to solve incredibly complex physical problems, really just for the sheer fun of it.
Pranks on the Great Dome. The absolute ultimate canvas for these early whiz kids was MIT's Great Dome. This central, iconic building on the campus became the focal point for the most ambitious and legendary physical hacks in the university's history. I mean, the creativity was literally off the charts. Beyond that legendary police car with its donut-eating dummy officer, these MIT students managed to completely transform that massive dome into R2-D2 from Star Wars. Another time, they constructed and mounted a giant, colorful propeller hat right on the very top of it. These legendary hacks were entirely physical. They were these massive feats of engineering, rigging, and stealth. It was lighthearted, it was totally fun, and it possessed a pure innocence that really defined the very first generation of hackers.
Chapter 2. The Rise of Phone Phreaking.
But of course, brilliant minds don't stay confined to physical pranks forever. Let's move to and see how this builds across a pretty drastic 30-year timeline, moving out of the physical world of campus buildings and into the early, kind of untamed frontier of telecommunications technology. We start with those innocent campus pranks in 1955, but by 1957, phone systems are being manipulated. By 1963, MIT students are actively hacking telecommunications networks. And then, by the mid-1980s, boom! We had a brick wall of federal legislation and deep cybersecurity fears. It's a rapid, dramatic shift from the innocence of childhood right into a very grim adulthood.
The real turning point where hackers were first connected to computing happened in 1963. According to MIT's own newspaper at the time, the campus hackers dramatically escalated their activities. First, they managed to tie up all the phone lines between MIT and Harvard. Then they manipulated the system to make long-distance calls, which, remember, were wildly expensive back then. And step 3, this is wild, they actually found a way to illegally charge all those calls to a local radar installation. MIT had to shut down public phone lines, and repeat offenders were expelled. Just imagine having to tell your parents you got kicked out of MIT just a week before graduation because you hacked the phone lines.
But you see, these MIT students were actually tapping into a much broader underground culture that was already bubbling up. This underground culture was known as phreaking. Notice the spelling there? Phreaking with a PH, a clever little play on the word phone. Phreaking was basically the art of using specific audio frequencies to manipulate analog phone systems, and the motivation was pretty simple. In those days, making a long-distance call wasn't just, tapping a contact on your smartphone. It was a massive, complicated ordeal, and it was insanely expensive.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the number 2600. Why is this number so crucial? Well, the person regarded as the father of phreaking didn't even mean to invent it. It was actually a blonde, 7-year-old boy named Joe Engressia. Joe had a remarkably keen sense of hearing, and one day he discovered that if he simply whistled into a phone receiver at the exact pitch of 2600 hertz, it would trigger the phone system's internal switches. Just by whistling, a 7-year-old could make free, long-distance, and international calls.
It was this accidental, absurd discovery that just blew the doors wide open.
Of course, not everyone has perfect pitch to whistle at exactly 2600 hertz, right? But another phreaker named John Draper figured out that a cheap toy whistle included in boxes of Captain Crunch cereal produced that exact same tone perfectly. He literally became known as Captain Crunch. As this whole thing evolved, hackers started creating electronic tone generators called blue boxes to just do the job for them. And guess who was building and marketing some of these blue boxes? Two young guys named Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Yeah, before they founded Apple and sold us $1,000 smartphones, they were building hardware to help people dodge phone charges.
Chapter 3. The Ethics of Phreaking.
This brings us to the rebellious adolescent phase of hacking. We're entering a gray area where the ethical lines blur significantly. The innocence of putting a police car on a dome? Yeah, that's gone. We are now dealing with actual money, services, and corporate infrastructure. On one hand, you have the phreakers. It's a classic underdog story, right? Clever individuals, sometimes literal kids, using incredible ingenuity to outsmart a massive system and save a few bucks. It kind of feels like a Robin Hood story. But on the other side, you have the phone companies. Now, sure, you might view them as anti-competitive monopolies charging unfair rates, but what if the victim was actually a small neighborhood telecom business losing real revenue to toll fraud? The reality was, this hacking was taking money out of someone's pocket, and the phone companies were escalating their networks to stop it, which eventually led to actual jail time for perpetrators.
So I want you to think about this for a second. Which side are you on? Do you side with the ingenuity of the phreakers who were, sticking it to the man? Or do you sympathize with the telecom companies who are having their services outright stolen? Understanding this gray area is absolutely critical, because this is the exact moment where the narrative shifts right before it takes a very dark turn.
Chapter 4. The Loss of Innocence.
We're now moving into our final era, the grim adulthood of hacking, where hackers could actually threaten global infrastructure. We are moving away from the era of kids just avoiding long-distance phone bills and stepping into a completely different reality. To understand this shift, we really have to look at 1983. That year, the Turing Award, which is essentially the Nobel Prize of Computer Science, was given to Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie. These two pioneers created the Unix operating system. They laid the groundwork for the programming languages that practically run our modern world today, from your smartphone all the way to global banking. Their authority in the computing space was absolute.
So the crucial point is what Ken Thompson said during his acceptance lecture in 1984, in this brilliant 3-page paper titled Reflections on Trusting Trust. He delivered a chilling warning. He said, you can't trust code that you didn't totally create yourself. Thompson fundamentally altered the hacker landscape right here. He was pointing out a terrifying reality. Computers were getting so incredibly complex that it was no longer possible to write every single piece of software from scratch yourself. You literally had to rely on code written by strangers.
And to prove just how dangerous that was, Thompson used a concept that he helped popularize, the Trojan horse. He demonstrated that he could hide a completely undetectable hack inside the compiler of a system. This meant the system would continuously infect itself without anyone ever seeing the malicious code in the source files. He proved that placing blind trust in code is unavoidable in a complex tech world, but man, it is also incredibly dangerous.
Thompson didn't just drop this technical bombshell. He issued a fierce warning. He implored Congress to crack down on hackers. He actually accused the media of dangerously romanticizing them, treating them as harmless whiz kids or even heroes, when in reality, they were becoming digital vandals. The days of treating hackers like those clever MIT students pulling practical jokes, those days were officially over. The stakes were simply too high now.
The result of this shifting landscape was incredibly swift. By 1986, Congress passed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, officially turning these once playful activities into serious federal crimes. The journey from brilliant, harmless MIT pranks to genuine cyber paranoia was fully complete. So I'll leave you with this final thought to consider. If the innocence of the early hacker days is truly gone forever, just how much of our modern world, our banks, our hospitals, our personal data, are we currently trusting to code we didn't write ourselves? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating evolution with me on The Explainer.